Hello, my name is Steve O'Reilly, and this is Roma Locuta Est Considers. What is RomaLocutaEst.com? You might well ask yourself. Well, it's a wee humble blog that the world little notes, nor will it long remember, but it is devoted to apologetics and commentary on Catholic topics, current events, and general Christian apologetics. We do not accept donations. No funding is received from any source. We're beholden to no one, and we alone are responsible for the content. This is episode 13 of Roma Locuta Est Considers, and in this episode we continue our look at Benepapism, and this will be the first of a two-part series, and this will cover Ganswein's speech. And again, so we're covering Archbishop Ganswein's speech, which has been called at times the expanded Petrine office speech. This speech has played, I think, a significant role in jump-starting the Benepapist controversy, and it continues to energize it to this day amongst its followers. As I go through both part 1 and 2, I'll presume that the viewer has some general familiarity with it. We're not going to read it, line by line, the whole thing. They'll just make this video or these two videos just way too long. But where you can find it, and I suggest if you haven't read it and you're interested in the controversy, Diane Montagna has translated it. And down here, if you just want to put it on pause, you can blow up your screen here and you can see the link to where you can find the speech. In terms of resources on Ganswein's speech, I've written about it in my book, Valid, The Resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, The Case Against the Benepapists. I devote an entire chapter to Ganswein's speech, and what's in the next two videos on Ganswein's speech come primarily from what's written in my book on the subject. But if you don't want to buy my book, and I will not be offended if you do not, but I do also have free articles on my blog, Roma Locuta Est, and in fact, my book is based in large measure upon articles that I had already written, in particular related to this set of videos on Ganswein's speech. I have a aptly named article entitled Regarding Ganswein's Speech. So that article hits on many of the same points that I hit upon in these next two videos. So I encourage you to check that out if you don't get my book. Okay, so before getting into Ganswein's speech and the objections that the Benepapists raise with regard to it, I first want to just kind of go over a little bit of background of where we are in the controversy at this point, that right before Ganswein actually gave his speech. But first, I recall for the viewer that in the Declaratio on February 11th, 2013, Benedict had said in that Declaratio that he was resigning the ministry of the Bishop of Rome in such a way that the See of Rome, the See of Peter, will be vacant, and that a new conclave would be necessary to elect a new Supreme Pontiff. Obvious from this is the fact that if there is no occupant of the See of Rome, if the See of Peter is vacant, clearly there is no Pope. Benedict said a conclave would then be required to elect a new Supreme Pontiff. Clearly this is because he knew he was no longer the Supreme Pontiff as of February 28, 2013, which was the date that he said his resignation would go into effect. Okay, and then the next thing is that Benedict made changes to the rules for the conclave that was necessitated by his resignation. He did this in his motu proprio, Normas Non Nullis. And the key takeaway, and I discussed this in some of my earlier videos, so I just point you back to that for more details, but the point is he made some minor modifications to the rules of John Paul II, which were found in, I think it's about Universis Dominis Gregis, and none of the changes that he made give any indication that that anyone could resign partly or anything of the sort. The rule changes that he made are consistent with long-standing understanding that the one who was elected Bishop of Rome is the true Pope and Supreme Pontiff from the moment of his election, if he is already consecrated a bishop. So there's no indication of any understanding of any thought that Benedict believed he was a partial pope or was maintaining anything. The rules that he passed are consistent with the rules of John Paul II and with canon law, particularly Canon 331, that the one who is elected Pope or elected Bishop of Rome is automatically Supreme Pontiff and is the true Pope. There isn't a true Pope and somebody else and a part Pope or anything like that. So again, these rules indicate Benedict fully understood that he had fully resigned the office of the papacy. And then in Benedict's last audience, which was held on February 27th, the day before his resignation went into effect, he gave a homily or speech, and I think it was done in St. Peter's Square before an audience which included any cardinals who were then in Rome at the time. And again, I talked about this as well in my videos on the Always is Also a Forever. But one line I would just point out here is that he admitted in his last audience that he will no longer have the power of governance in the church, and he spoke about his resignation. Now I know the Benepapists are going to say, oh, when he says power of governance, he really only means this small part of his papal powers, and he's keeping everything else. And that's, you know, that's certainly, I think that's ridiculous, but the point here is, even though they claim that that phrase power of governance, or that he gives up the power of governance somehow is consistent with their theory, the truth of the matter is that the fact that he said he gave up the power of governance is perfectly consistent with the view that he truly did resign the papacy. And then continuing with the last audience, I guess key points to remember. And again, I point you to parts 1 and 2 of the Always is Also Forever set of videos I did. Benedict spoke of a continuation of his bond of charity with the faithful that who had become his sons and daughters upon his election to the papacy, and that even though he was going to resign, he would continue to kind of carry this bond with them, and that he would therefore, because of this love that he has for the sons and daughters he took on when he became Pope, even though he's going to resign, he's going to continue and pray for them, his sons and daughters, after his resignation. So that's kind of like the mission that he was taking on. So again, I point you back to episodes 8 and 9 of the series on Benepapism. And then just a few hours before his resignation went into effect on February 28th. Again, I just want to note that I'm kind of taking you through like a little timeline of events, beginning here up here at the top with February 11th. Now we're down to February 28th, on the actual day of Benedict's resignation, which would go into effect at 8 p.m. that evening. About a couple hours before, I think it was around 5:30, Benedict spoke to a group of Catholic pilgrims from the Italian Diocese of Albano, and speaking to them from a window, he said, I am no longer, or I will no longer be the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church. I will be until 8 this evening, and then no longer. I am simply a pilgrim beginning the last leg of his pilgrimage on earth. I am simply a pilgrim beginning the last leg of his pilgrimage on earth. So again, here he is clearly stating on the day of his resignation, just a couple hours before it, that he's acknowledging that he will no longer be the Supreme Pontiff. And that statement is simply not consistent with the view of the Benepapists. We've seen, depending on the theory, there are those who hold to the Ratzinger Code. They have like their own take on this, and I did a kind of rebutted the position of Andrea Cianci in my two-part series on the Ratzinger Code, so I point you back to that. Or I forget if it's a two-part or a three-part series I did on that. I think it's a three-part series I did on that, so I point you back to that. But the Benepapists who claim that there was a substantial error in what Benedict did, they have no explanation about this. In fact, they just ignore it. One Benepapist, Mark Doherty, I think he just outright says that Benedict contradicted himself. So there's no real attempt to try to find consistency or to harmonize what Benedict said, because they can't. They just simply can't. So again, here he is, Benedict saying, I will no longer be the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church as of 8 p.m. that evening. So a clear statement that he understood that he would not be the Pope any longer. So having reviewed kind of like the timeline up to the actual day of Benedict's resignation, everything points to a true, valid resignation. There is no place for a Ratzinger Code understanding. There is no place for an understanding of some sort of substantial error on his part. It's clear that all these statements here made by Benedict point to what his state of mind is and what he was thinking. So now we're talking about in this video about Ganswein's speech, but we have to remember that Ganswein's speech came 3 years after Benedict's resignation. So the Benepapists want to try to kind of find little breadcrumbs in it to kind of spin it for their theory, but this is again 3 years after the fact. So it's clear, given all these statements made by Benedict, and we have the record of what he said at the time of his resignation, it's clear that we should read Benedict through Benedict, read Benedict through his own words, and not read Benedict and understand Benedict through what Ganswein said. Now, I don't think there's any real contradiction between the two, but I think I would just point that out, that we should really be looking at Benedict to understand what went on with the resignation, and Ganswein is only secondary, even though I think some of the Benepapists would like to kind of put Ganswein's speech at the forefront and somehow spin it so to say that Ganswein somehow is stating that Benedict only resigned the papacy partly, or he kept the papacy or something like that. But it's clear that if you look at Benedict's words, that's not the case. And I think looking at Ganswein's words, and we'll go through them here in a bit, that we'll see that Ganswein was not claiming that Benedict held the papacy or that Benedict resigned the papacy only in part. All right, so let's just dive into the objections. Again, I just would remind folks that I'm not going to read through the whole Ganswein speech here before getting into the objections. I'm assuming here that the viewer or those interested who have gotten this far in the video have some familiarity with Ganswein's speech, what's said in it, what the content of it is, and I certainly provided the address for it, where you can find it on the web earlier in this video if you're interested in catching up. But here are the four main objections that I'm going to be looking at over the next couple videos. The first is that the plain meaning of the words of Ganswein's speech proves that Benedict intended to only partly resign the papacy, or maybe even to hold on to it completely, depending on your point of view as a Benepapist. So the plain meaning of the words proves that Benedict XVI made a substantial error, and therefore his resignation would be invalid. The second objection we'll look at is that Ganswein's kind of over-the-top language in his speech is odd for an ordinary resignation. A Benepapist interpretation is the only explanation for it. It's claimed. So it's kind of like one of the objections I think Dr. Mazza might make about Ganswein's speech, and others. And then the third objection is that there's a violation of the principle of non-contradiction, that Benedict's resignation cannot be like every other papal resignation if Benedict is history's first Pope Emeritus. And I'll read a more detailed version of that objection when we get to it. So the first video here will, I think, cover these first three objections. My second video on this Ganswein speech will we'll just look at the fourth objection and then provide an overall summary. But the fourth objection is that Ganswein, in his speech, spoke of an expanded Petrine ministry. He used terms like a shared ministry and a synodal ministry or a collegial ministry or something to that effect. And the Benepapists claim that this can only mean that Benedict believed that he was still Pope in some way. So if he thinks he can share or takes a part in an expanded Petrine ministry, they claim, obviously to them, this means that Benedict believed he was still Pope in some real way. So those are the four objections. Okay, so here is the first objection regarding the plain meaning of the text. This is an objection that Anne Barnhard had made in one of her articles. You can find it. The article is actually, I think I got it from a repost by request. And it's entitled, "The Mountain of Evidence That Pope Benedict Never Validly Resigned is Like Kilauea. It just keeps spewing truth magma." So that's Anne Barnhard spewing some truth magma at us. But that can be found here on her blog. And here's the site if you'd like to go read it all in its glory for yourself. But let's kind of go through what her objection is. Okay, so let's read through Ms. Barnhardt's objection here from her article that I highlighted just a moment ago. So Pope Benedict himself made this perfectly clear in his last audience on 27 February 2013, and it was reconfirmed with his approval on 20 May 2016 by his personal secretary, an incredibly suspicious character, according to Ms. Barnhard, that's Archbishop Georg Ganswein, in a speech at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, laying out Pope Benedict's mindset vis-a-vis his failed partial resignation. Okay, so so I think first of all, the attack on Ganswein is certainly not justified. He's not a suspicious character. I mean, he was a faithful friend to Pope Benedict for a long time, so that's just completely uncalled for on her part. But here she's claiming that both the last audience and Ganswein's speech point to Benedict's mindset versus his failed partial resignation. Now, she believes that the resignation, that he intended to only partially resign the resignation. So she's here claiming that the last audience and the speech, Ganswein's speech, point to that very fact that she claims. And she highlights here that Ganswein's speech was written or given with Benedict's approval. She initially, when she first wrote this article way back when was this back? I think back, I guess 2018, 19, I forget the exact date. I have the repost date down here as being 2021. But when she first wrote this, she said that Ganswein gave the speech with his approval. But I think in later articles, she actually claimed that I think Benedict edited Ganswein's speech. So I guess she claims to have a source who knows both facts. So I'm not going to get into that. But I will stipulate that she has a source. I don't know it, but I'll grant it, and that this is a fact. But that's okay, because I don't see that there's any problem with Ganswein's speech or the last audience in maintaining that Benedict's resignation was valid. But let's press on here. So, continuing on with the same objection, then Ms. Barnhart goes on to say, to deny the clarity of these words, that's the words of the last audience and the clarity of the words, in her opinion, of Ganswein's speech, to deny the clarity of these words is fundamentally dishonest. That's bold in the original, I think at least it was in caps in the original. So to deny the clarity of these words is fundamentally dishonest, as in you have to lie in order to argue that these words mean anything other than their plain meaning. Well, I don't deny the clarity of the words. I just deny Ms. Barnhart's interpretation. But it seems here Ms. Barnhart is alleging that anyone who disagrees with her is a liar. But as to the plain meaning, we will look at the words in context of Ganswein's speech, and I think it will show, I'm confident it will show that the plain meaning actually supports my position regarding Ganswein's speech and not Ms. Barnhart's. Okay, so again, Ms. Barnhart says to deny the clarity of these words, again, that's the last audience in Ganswein's speech, is fundamentally dishonest, as in you have to lie in order to argue these words mean anything other than their plain meaning, which is, another way of putting that is, as in you have to lie in order to argue these words mean anything other than what Ann Barnhart says they mean. That's what that means. I mean, really. So anyway, but Ms. Barnhart goes on here to say, in my experience, that means her experience, every person who has made this argument is financially dependent upon the institutional church ideology. I'm not quite sure what that means, but whether it be a salaried position, paid editorial writing gigs, a pension, or donations or begging. To deny objective reality is pretty much the textbook definition of having no integrity. Again, that's Ms. Barnhart's accusation against those who don't see the meaning of the last audience or Ganswein's speech the way she does, the plain meaning or the plain words of it. Now, this is, I think, a non-serious objection, but I'm not quite sure who she means by this. I have some reason to think that she means me in part, I guess. I'm not aware of many people who have written. I've written a lot on Ganswein's speech, going back to almost the very beginning of the Benepapist controversy, at least back to 2017. I think around June or July-ish when I first wrote my first article on Benepapism. Then I called it BIP, now Benepapism. But I'm not aware of many others who've taken the time to kind of analyze and look at the words of the last audience and Ganswein's speech and have written articles on it. I don't think I've seen hardly anything on it. I think the only people who might have written something on it might be possibly Andrea Cianci, and maybe Estefania Costa, who I think included something of it in her book on Benepapism. She's pro the view that Benedict's resignation was not valid. But those are the only two. So, but anyway, she says every person in her experience, so that must include me. So I will take it as such. Otherwise, I'll feel left out. But for the record, I would just say, just to make it clear, in terms of her accusations of being financially dependent upon the institutional church ideology, I'm not paid by the church or anybody else to write what I do. I'm certainly not in a salaried position where someone pays me to write what I do for my blog or my books or anything like that. Either a church organization or a non-church organization or whoever. No one pays me, or no one directs me to write what I write. No one suggests anything to me as to what to write. As far as paid editorial writing gigs, many moons ago, I had written some articles for an apologetics magazine called This Rock, which I think was run by Catholic Answers, and doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. I think you can find some of the articles online, but at least for that magazine, we just had a small stipend. It wasn't much, but again, that was a long time ago. So that's just for disclosure purposes. That's I think the only thing I took money for paid editorial or any writing for, at least for any articles I wrote. Recently, I did write an article for 1 Peter 5 entitled "Whither Benepapism." I think that goes back to March. I wasn't aware that you got paid for that until actually, I think a few weeks, maybe a month, a couple months after I wrote it. I did get an email from 1 Peter 5 actually asking for, I think, my address and stuff so they could forward me whatever it was they were going to forward me. And I don't know how much it was going to be. I assume it would be just some minor stipend again. But I forget if the email actually said how much it was, but it wasn't a lot. But I didn't answer because I'm not looking to get paid for it. That's not why I wrote my article. So anyway, so in terms of pensions, I don't have a pension that influences me. I'm not on pension at the moment. And in terms of donations and blagging, I find this kind of a curious accusation on the part of Ms. Barnhart. In terms of donations, again, neither myself or my blog, I don't seek donations. I do not accept donations. I don't have a button on my blog that you can hit to donate to me. There is no Patreon button or link or anything like that on my blog. I do have links to my books, so you can go out on, hit the donate. I think it's an icon of a book and of my books. You can link out to Amazon to buy a copy of either Valid, my book on Benepapism, or Pia Fidelis, which is my historical, is book one of my historical fiction trilogy. And that's the only thing. I don't have any donation buttons on my website. So I do find it curious because one person I know who does have a donation link is on her website is Ann Barnhart. So it's kind of curious that she would mention that here. I don't hold it against her or against anyone else for that matter who seeks donations on their blog. That's certainly their business to do it, but I don't do it. Like I said, I don't seek it. I don't accept it. So So there that is. Anyway, but yeah, in terms of my books, I can definitely say I'm not financially dependent upon them. Thank heaven. So um, that's so yeah, again, money is not influencing me. The books. The books that I write, they reflect my views. My views and uh, are not informed by my books. The books reflect my views. They don't inform them. So anyway, so that's that, and I think you can see that this objection again is it's non-serious. It's ad hominem, so it's fallacious. So it's ad hominem. It's a case of poisoning the well against those who poison the well against those who might take a position opposite Anne Barnhart. So in reality, this is really kind of a textbook case of gaslighting. So I think the viewer who is interested in this uh, controversy can kind of see it for what it is. That's all I got to say on this particular objection. Okay, so let's move on here to objection 2. Second objection is that Ganswein's over-the-top language is odd for just an ordinary resignation. A Benepapist interpretation is the only explanation for it. So that's kind of the claim. So let's just take a quick excerpt here from Ganswein's speech, just to give an example. I think kind of some of the overtop language that they're talking about, that Benepapist would be talking about, and in my view too, I think it is kind of over the top. I mean, but I think I'll get into why that's the case later on in this video. Well, here's an example. So it's picking up in the middle of Ganswein's speech, and I is Ganswein. And I too, a first-hand witness of the spectacular and unexpected step of Benedict XVI, I must admit that what always comes to mind is the well-known and brilliant axiom with which, in the Middle Ages, John Duns Scotus justified the divine decree for the Immaculate Conception of the Mother of God. And excuse my Latin pronunciation here. Decuit, potuit, fecit. That is to say, it was fitting because it was reasonable. God could do it, therefore he did it. I apply the this is again Ganswein. I apply the axiom to the decision to resign in the following way. It was fitting because Benedict was aware that he lacked the necessary strength for the extremely onerous office. He could do it because he had already thoroughly thought through, from a theological point of view, the possibility of popes emeritus for the future. So he did it. So it is kind of over the top. I mean, there's no two ways about it. So let's move on and see what this is about. So on the last slide, those were the words of Ganswein. So now here I pick up kind of Dr. Edmund Mazza's kind of commentary on it. It comes from one of his articles. He is a Benepapist. He has his own book out on Benepapism that came out, I think, the end of last year, beginning of this year, 2023. So here, this article comes from, it's a guest post, Dr. Edmund Mazza's position paper on the invalidity of Pope Benedict's resignation, Pope Emeritus Enigma, an explanation at last. And this appeared on Anne Barnhart's blog. And that's where you can find it. So if you want to find it, you can put this page or this slide on pause and just jot down these terms to find the article. So anyway, so I quote from Dr. Mazza above here. So this is all Dr. Mazza now. So again, this is picking up in the middle of Dr. Mazza's article. And I think it illustrates the objection. Again, the objection says Ganswein's over-the-top language is odd for an ordinary resignation. A Benepapist interpretation is the only explanation for it. So that's the objection, and I think Dr. Mazza's paragraph here, I think, eloquently illustrates, illustrates the Benepapist view here. So again, Dr. Mazza's words here. Or as Archbishop Ganswein, quoting Scotus on Mary's Immaculate Conception, said, Decuit, patuit, fecit. It was fitting, God could do it, therefore he did it. In this case, so did Benedict. If he truly separated Peter's primacy from the Roman See, then Ganswein's gushings over Benedict's maneuver at last appear apt. And again, now here, Dr. Mazza kind of briefly takes some quotes of some of the extraordinary language that Ganswein used in his opinion. So, for example, he is in quotes here: profoundly transformed, extraordinary courage, daring, spectacular, unexpected, a new phase, turning point, historic, entirely different, never been a step like it, unprecedented, terms that fall flat describing a simple bishop's retirement, even a pope's. So again, so you can see the point, I think, that Dr. Mazza is making, that that you have all these extraordinary words being used by Ganswein, the really kind of over-the-top reference to Don Scotus's famous quote about the Immaculate Conception, and then but Dr. Mazza then goes on to say that there really is no other explanation for this other than the Benepapist interpretation, is that clearly Ganswein is intimating that Benedict did not fully resign. So again, here's Dr. Mazza picking up here. After having made this comment, Dr. Mazza continues, only a Captain Kirk Kobayashi Maru solution by Pope Benedict could justify the use of such superlatives, while simultaneously answering all the criticisms of his renunciation and satisfying all the parameters of the Pope Emeritus controversy. So with Dr. Mazza, you'll always get a TV or movie reference in there, thrown in there somewhere. So if you didn't know what the Kobayashi Maru reference is, you can find it on Wikipedia. So again, Dr. Mazza is saying that the only solution to explain this, the only possible one, is that Benedict's resignation, that Benedict attempted to partially resign, and this is so extraordinary, and only that kind of understanding of Ganswein's speech explains everything. That's Dr. Mazza's claim. But is it true? Is what Dr. Mazza says is true? Is it true? Is it really the case that the only true explanation for Ganswein's superlatives and comments about Benedict and the Petrine ministry or expanded ministry is the only explanation that Benedict believes himself to still be Pope, or believed himself to still be Pope at the time? Is that the only possible explanation here that makes sense? I don't think so, but let's go on and kind of address some of this. Okay, so for background, we took a little peek at what Ganswein had said about Don Scotus, the Immaculate Conception, and kind of applying that to the momentousness of that to Benedict's resignation and decision to become a Pope Emeritus. And then we saw Dr. Mazza's commentary on that, or at least a portion of his commentary on that. So with that as an introduction, I think we can move on now to address Ganswein's superlatives and his reference to the Petrine ministry and the expanded ministry. But to really understand Ganswein, we must first understand the context of his speech, something I have not seen any Benepapist really address. So begins my reply to objection 2. So as I said, the first thing I'd say is that the context is important to really understand what's going on with the superlatives and some of the other things that Ganswein has said, in which I'll get to, I think, important objection to the commentary on the expanded ministry and stuff like that. That actually will be in I'll respond to that in my reply to objection 4, which will appear in the second part of this video, two-part video series. So the first thing about the context I'd like to note is that what was the occasion for this speech? It was given in May 2016. I think it was given to the Gregorian. So I'm not sure where in the Gregorian it was, but there's probably they probably have some beautiful sala, some beautiful room where a bunch of people gather around and drink wine and eat cheese and things and stuff like that between speeches is what I'm thinking. Probably this is how I kind of picture what was going on. People sit around and listen to the speakers for 45 minutes, an hour or two, and then they have wine and cheese reception afterwards. But anyway, so it is a presentation. So the occasion of his speech was the presentation of a book on Pope Benedict's pontificate. The book was entitled Beyond the Crisis of the Church, the Pontificate of Benedict XVI. So it was written by Father Roberto Regali. So that's the occasion for the speech. So that's why Ganswein was invited there to give his speech. So again, he's giving us an overview of the book. He's talking about the book and the pontificate of Benedict. So it's not a theological presentation. So it's not like there's a bunch of bishops and cardinals around there disputing some theological issue. So it's not a theological presentation. So there's not expectation that there's going to be great theological precision and carefulness in how one speaks, right? So it's not, you're really defining terms carefully and making a precise theological argument or anything like that. He's giving a retrospective on Pope Benedict. And, as I said, these kind of retrospectives that are done on popes, and when people write books about a pontificate, right, typically they're dead. It's been what I think it's been about 800 years since Celestine had resigned the papacy. So it might be between 600 and 800 years since the last pope resigned. So since that last resignation and now, if someone's writing a book about a pontificate or a recent pope, it's because the pope is dead. That's why people are gathered around there. They're talking about the pontificate. So this is usually done after a pope has died. But here, it's kind of unique. We're talking about someone's written a book, and the pope, or the former pope, he's still alive. So that's something that Ganswein actually noted in his speech. Hey, he's still alive. We're here talking about him. So it was a unique occasion. So you have Ganswein on this occasion talking about a pope, the subject, the pope. He's still living former Pope Benedict. So thus, in this regard, the event was quite exceptional and unique. Anyway, so let's continue. And another thing to, of course, recall is that Ganswein, who was asked to speak at this event, he was a close friend of Benedict XVI. He'd been his personal secretary for quite some time and knew Benedict beforehand when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, and I think possibly going back further. But clearly he's known him a long time. One thing you can say is that Ganswein would have been certainly aware that Dante, in his great work, had consigned Celestine V to hell. Celestine V, again, was a pope, I think about 800 years ago, who had resigned. He was a hermit. He was elected pope, reigned for maybe 4 or 5 months, and kind of threw up his hands after a while and said, "This job's not for me. I want to go back to being a hermit." And so he resigned. Unfortunately for Celestine V, he didn't get to go back to that cave. Benepapist VIII actually threw him in prison so he wouldn't cause any mischief for him. But the point is that history had looked down, or certainly Dante had looked down on a pope who had resigned because he didn't want to be pope anymore. So it's kind of a poignant moment there for Ganswein that his best friend Pope Benedict XVI might be considered in the category of a Celestine V for having walked away from the papacy. I think making the problem worse is that Ganswein was well aware that many of Benedict's closest friends had opposed his resignation and were disappointed in that resignation. He said as much, certainly alluded to it in his speech, and we know that Ganswein was actually one of those men who was opposed to the resignation. So here you have Ganswein on this occasion, a retrospective of Benedict's pontificate, and he has in mind a man who had walked away from the papacy when knowing that his friends had opposed it, and that kind of history, or certainly literary history, kind of looked down on a pope who had done that, in the case of Celestine V. So actually I skipped ahead there, but still, anyway, it was clear that Benedict's friends and associates were deeply disappointed at the resignation. So I'll just leave it there and then move on here. So the point is, right, that so Ganswein's at a presentation about the pontificate of Benedict, Rogali's book about the pontificate, yet Benedict's still alive. And then you have in mind that kind of literary history, at least, did not look so kindly upon Celestine V for walking away from the papacy. Someone who might have served as an example to Benedict was not looked kindly upon by Dante, at least. And he also knew, Ganswein knew, and he actually, I think, had commented in his speech, or he did allude to it in his speech, that many of Benedict's closest friends and associates were deeply disappointed and opposed to his resignation. So you have that kind of like negative vibe about that. So Ganswein, as a speaker, wanting to say nice things about his friend, obviously, and being sincere and honest about it. So what kind of tact does he want to say, right? So you kind of see kind of the structure of how he might want to approach the issue of his speech about Benedict as Pope and then ex-Pope. He wants to be able to say kind of like he's an important Pope and now he's an important ex-Pope. So it's, I think, kind of understandable that Ganswein, in this light, might want to paint a picture of Benedict's decision in the best possible light. Give his post-papal life particular meaning or import. So on the one hand, he wanted to sing glowing praise of his friend, the pre-resignation Pope Benedict and his papacy. On the other hand, he wanted to also paint a flattering, almost like a panegyrical description of a still living but resigned Benedict, ascribing some special purpose to a post-resignation life as a Pope Emeritus. So in that light, I think it's kind of understandable, or at least whether it's justifiable or not, the extent to which he did so. But I think it's understandable that Ganswein kind of celebrated Benedict's decision with certainly a degree of hyperbole in relation to his decision to resign and and take on the honorific title of Pope Emeritus. So I think thus we might understand, even if we roll our eyes and groan, why Ganswein went to the extreme of applying Duns Scotus's axiom, decuit patuit fecit, to Benedict's decision to resign and become Pope Emeritus. Anyway, so above, I try to provide some background. I said that I will address some more particular issues, such as the taking on of or the use of the phrase an expanded Petrine ministry and all that. Again, that's an objection, my reply to objection 4. And I think I'll touch upon Pope Emeritus, I think in my reply to objection 3, which I'm getting to here momentarily. But again, in terms of context, to explain why Ganswein might have gone on with these superlatives. I mean, the only explanation is not what Dr. Mazza suggested, that it's the only possible reason why he could use these superlatives was because of a Kobayashi Maru decision that this pointed to Benedict's decision to partially resign the papacy or something like that. That's not the only explanation. I mean, there's certainly simpler explanations for that. One, it's the context of the event itself. It's the speakers are coming up talking about Benedict's life as a pope. I've never read Bergali's book, but it does say the pontificate of Benedict XVI, though I assume it did not really touch upon his work as a prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. I think he did. I think Bergali did touch a little bit upon his decision to resign. Obviously, that would be part of the pontificate. The decision to resign, at least, would be part of the pontificate. So I'm sure that was part of the subject matter. But it wasn't a theological presentation on the part of Ganswein. It's usually done, have such a thing is usually when the Pope has died, and but here the subject's still alive, so it's like, hey, I'm still alive, I'm not dead yet, so you got to say something nice about this person. So you kind of think maybe of like the resignation of Joe in accounting. Everyone wants to send him off with some really nice words. So you say a lot of nice things about him. He's the best accountant of all the accountants I knew. He was one of them. So anyway, but you have here in the case with Benedict, of course, Ganswein was a close friend of Benedict. There was a lot of negativity surrounding his decision to resign. So Ganswein's, I think, had to address that in his commentary for this day, for this speech. So you can see, you can kind of understand why he's going to say a lot of nice things about, and he did. If you read the speech, he does kind of walk through Regali's presentation of at a high level through Regali's presentation in his own speech, what Regali wrote in his book about the pontificate. So you can understand that from Ganswein's perspective, he wants to portray his friend in a great light as a pope, and to kind of say something nice about his life now as ex-pope. His decision, they kind of put some nice spin on it. Now, he might sincerely believe it, but he wants to put it in the best possible light possible. So he wants to, still show there's some special meaning to what Benedict's doing. So you can understand you can certainly understand the motivation why he might engage in a lot of superlatives about that, to show why this is so great what he did. So I think that kind of explains it. We'll get into some of the other issues again about his references to expanded ministry, but in terms of superlatives and things like that, I think well explains it. But the important thing to remember throughout it all, in terms of thinking of the superlatives and also the use of expanded ministry and some of those other phrases that Ganswein used, I think like a notable ministry or a collegial member or however some of the other terms he had used, that Ganswein still reiterates, does make references in his speech to the fact that Benedict's no longer Pope in various ways. I mean, he says in his speech that he resigned. He does say in his speech that Benedict left the papal throne. He does put a timeline on the pontificate. He says that the pontificate ended in 2013, so it's not like continuing still at the time of the speech in 2016, 3 years later. Ganswein in his speech talks about witnessing Benedict taking off the fisherman's ring, which is one of the two signs that are two symbols of that a pope receives upon ascending the papacy, ascending into office. And one of them is to put on the fisherman's ring, to have it presented to him and have him put it on. He was there, Ganswein was, when Benedict took it off, so that was something he mentioned. So again, that signifies, again, giving up the authority of being pope. And then he goes on elsewhere in his speech to speak of there only being one pope. There are not two popes, he says in his speech. And he also speaks of Francis as Benedict's successor. The only way he could be Benedict's successor is by a papal conclave, which elects a new supreme pontiff. And according to Canon 331, whoever is elected Bishop of Rome automatically becomes supreme pontiff and true pope. So all these references are in there to the end of Benedict's pontificate. So, again, so I think the claim that the only explanation is the one suggested by, the likes of Dr. Mazza, the only explanation is that Ganswein is referring to some Kobayashi Maru decision by Benedict to only partially resign the papacy. I mean, I think that's clearly is not borne out by a closer examination of the context of the speech. But we will look at other aspects here shortly of the speech as well, and in part as we look at objection 3 here momentarily, and then in objection 4 in my next video. Okay, so let's move on to objection 3. And again, this comes from Anne Barnhart's blog. And it's an excerpt from one of her articles. The article, I think, was called, "If Pope Benedict is the first ever Pope Emeritus, doesn't that mean that his ontological state is different from the popes who actually resigned?" Okay, that's the question. So this is from that article. So again, this is Anne Barnhart speaking. If Pope Benedict's resignation was just like every previous papal resignation, and Pope Emeritus is just a way of saying resign Pope, why is Pope Benedict XVI referred to by Ganswein, with Pope Benedict's approval, as having created a new institution as history's first Pope Emeritus? How can Pope Benedict be simultaneously just exactly like all other resigned popes, but at the same time history's first Pope Emeritus, entirely different from all previous popes that resigned, and that to date there has never been a step taken like that of Pope Benedict XVI? That is a stone-cold violation of the law of non-contradiction, says Anne Barnhart. She continues, "Something cannot be and not be at the same time. Pope Benedict cannot both be and not be the first Pope Emeritus. Something cannot be both entirely different and entirely the same as something else. So something must be wrong with the base premise. And because the logical truth table here is yielding first-degree corollaries in violation of the second of the three laws of thought, and that would be the principle of non-contradiction. Okay, so that's the objection from Anne Barnhart. Is there a way to address this, or are we stumped? Let's see. Okay, so we have our objection here. The violation of the principle of non-contradiction, objection 3, violation of the principle of non-contradiction. Benedict XVI's resignation cannot be like every other papal resignation if Benedict is history's first Pope Emeritus. That's the objection. All right, so first I would begin my answer by stating that Ms. Barnhart misstates the principle of non-contradiction when she says, as she describes it, something cannot be and not be at the same time. That's her statement of the principle of non-contradiction. That is a misstatement of it. Properly stated, the principle of non-contradiction should be stated something more along the lines as this. Something cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. That was left off of Ms. Barnhart's analysis and her use of the principle of non-contradiction. So her statement was wrong. The principle is something cannot be and not be at the same time in the same sense. So you can kind of begin to see perhaps where I'm going with this is that we're going to examine some of her statements and see if some of the uses of the terms that she says are violations of contradiction are really not, because words or phrases are being used in a different sense. So let's see. But before moving on to more directly address her objection, I just want to call a few things to mind, because I think it lays the groundwork to actually responding to her objection. The first would be Canon 185. So let's take a look at that. Okay, when Pope Benedict resigned the papacy, there was no canon that referred to a Pope Emeritus. He did create that title. I believe it was only released in a press release a few days, or if not the day before he actually resigned. So we don't have any kind of official, treatise, theological definition of Pope Emeritus in Benedict's mind. We don't have that. What we do have is Canon 185, as I referenced on the last slide. Now, Canon 185, it does not refer to a pope, because it refers to resignations that have to be accepted. A papal resignation does not have to be accepted. However, the use of emeritus here in Canon 185 will give us a sense, though, of the meaning of the term emeritus. So what Canon 185 reads as follows: the title of emeritus can be conferred upon the person who loses an office by reason of age, or by a resignation which has been accepted. And again, this does not apply to a pope, because a papal resignation is not accepted. It doesn't need to be accepted. Whereas the resignations in 185, that's the reference there, it does need to be accepted. Still, you can see by way of analogy what Benedict, who certainly knew canon law, of this reference, that emeritus here is still an analogy for what he did. Emeritus is here an honorific for a lost office. It references, it's conferred upon a person who loses an office. So if Benedict, by analogy, is applying emeritus to himself, he's even if he combines it with Pope Emeritus, he's speaking of a lost office. So I think that should be pretty clear. The title Pope Emeritus may be conferred on him who loses an office due to resignation. The significance of this fact is relevant to the argument over whether Benedict still believed he held his papal office. The answer here must be no, as emeritus connotes the reality of a loss of office, which itself clearly demonstrates Benedict recognized his loss of office, in other words, his loss of papal office, due to his resignation. So let's keep that in mind. So someone who uses emeritus has lost his office. Okay, so we just discussed Canon 185. Let's kind of press on with a few other background points a couple other background points before we reply directly to Ms. Barnhart's objection. Okay, I think another key point here that I want to point out, again as background, is Benedict XVI's correspondence with Cardinal Brammuller. Now this correspondence took, actually I probably should have said Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, and his correspondence with Cardinal Brammuller. This correspondence occurred after the effective resignation of Benedict XVI. So let's take a look at it. Okay, so this excerpt from one of Benedict's letters to Cardinal Brammuller. I'm pulling this from an article by Edward Penton. It's entitled Benedict XVI Discusses His Resignation in Newly Published Letters. It appeared in the National Catholic Register on September 19, 2018. And this was a part of a back and forth between Benedict resigned Benedict. So this is after his resignation. And he's writing to Cardinal Brammuller. Cardinal Brammuller was upset about Benedict's resignation and Benedict's use of the term Pope Emeritus. So, like saying it hasn't been used before and all that sort of thing. So he objected to the use of that title. So Benedict responds to that complaint by Cardinal Brammuller. Benedict writes, he says, in your letter, again, this is Benedict referring to Cardinal Brammuller. So in your recent interview with the FAZ, so that's the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I do not speak German. Anyway, so in your recent interview with the FAZ, you said that I created, with the construction of the Pope Emeritus, a figure that does not exist in the entirety of church history. Benedict continues, of course, you know very well that popes have retired, even if very rarely. What were they afterwards? Pope Emeritus? Or what instead? So, in this context, Benedict is defending his use of Pope Emeritus. He takes issue with Brammuller, who said Pope Emeritus did not exist in the church history. Benedict's implicit argument here in his reply, whatever its merits, is that there have been other retired popes in history like himself. And what were they? He asks, if not Pope Emeritus. That is to say, Benedict believed the previous retired or resigned popes were each a Pope Emeritus. They were in fact, if not in title. So that's his point. That's the kind of rhetorical point that Benedict is saying in his rebuttal to Cardinal Brammuller, is that what else could have been but Pope Emeritus. They were that in fact, even if they were not that entitled by name. So that's kind of his response. So in the view of Pope Benedict Emeritus, Benedict XVI, that title, or the reality, the fact of a Pope Emeritus, did pre-exist, even if he was the first to use the actual title. That's the point. Okay, so for background, we've looked at Canon 185, and we've looked at the correspondence of Benedict with Cardinal Brandmuller. Let's take a look at what comes up next. All right, so let's take a quick look at a couple excerpts from some of Peter Seewald's interviews with Benedict XVI after his resignation. Okay, so here I'm taking a couple excerpts from Peter Seewald's interview. It comes from his book. I think I have this from my Kindle version of the book. The title of which is his interview with Benedict, entitled Benedict XVI, A Life, Volume 2, Professor and Prefect to Pope and Pope Emeritus, 1966 to the present, page 669. So the first excerpt, again, both these are from the same page. So again, here Benedict is referring to the use of the term emeritus or Pope Emeritus. He says, in this formula, Pope Emeritus, both things are implied. No actual legal authority any longer, because he's not Pope. So that's honorific, Pope Emeritus. But a relationship which remains even if it is invisible. And here the relationship, again, is he's just speaking of, well, I'll go on to the next one here. He goes, so he goes on, a legal spiritual formula avoids any idea of there being two popes. So again, Benedict is saying there are not two popes. There's one pope. So this formula avoids any idea of there being two popes at the same time. A bishopric can only have one incumbent. But the formula also expresses a spiritual link, which can never or cannot ever be taken away. So what we're seeing here is that he's not speaking of maintaining any kind of legal office. He's not Pope in any way. So what's this spiritual link that Benedict is talking about? Well, he's talked about it in his last audience on February 27th, 2013. He kind of referenced it. And he's alluded to it as well in his interviews with Peter Seewald. What's he referring to? Well, that goes back to the always is also a forever. If you look, it's in one of the chapters in my book on the last audience. I have a lot of articles on the last audience on my blog. One of them is entitled Regarding the Last Audience. And I have 2 videos on the always is also a forever. I believe it's episodes 8 and 9 of the Roma Locuta S series on Benepapism. So what did he say in the last audience? Benedict had talked about how he was engaged by the Lord always and forever when he was elected. Okay, what does that mean? Well, he defined what he meant in the very next line. Benedict said, the always, he is referring to the loss of the private dimension of his life, the loss of his privacy. Then he goes on to say what he means by the loss of privacy. Then he goes on to talk about how when you become Pope, you lose your privacy, but you gain sons and daughters and brothers and sisters, and this mutual relationship. They kind of love me as Pope, and I love them as Pope. And he goes on. It's very eloquent. It's a very beautiful talk that he gives. I think that's been butchered by the Benepapist, unfortunately. And then in the next paragraph, he goes on talking about how he says the always is also a forever. But again, he refers to that being there is no return from this to the private life, to the private life after he resigns. He's not going to return to a life of traveling and speeches and that sort of thing. Now, I'm just going off by memory right now. You can look for the exact detail of what he said in episodes 8 and 9, or in one of my articles or book. But the point is that what he's referring, there's no return to the private life. There's no return from this relationship, this bond of charity that he has taken on. When he became Pope, he becomes a father to sons and daughters and things of that in a spiritual sense to the church. Even though he's resigning, he's maintaining this love. He's not going to simply walk away like, "Hey, thanks, thanks for all the fish. I'm out of here. I'm checking out." It's not the same thing as like resigning as CEO or Bob in accounting resigning and just kind of leaving behind the office and returning to his family. No, the point is when you become Pope, the church in a very spiritual sense becomes the family for the Pope, and he kind of recognizes this moral relationship, moral responsibility he has. So he loved them. He had this true responsibility as Pope, and even though he resigns, he still has this affection, this love, this charity towards his sons and daughters of the church, and he's going to continue. And that's the point where he goes on the last audience and says, "Because of this, I am going to pray for the church." He's going to devote his life now to praying for the church. And Ganswein, even in his speech, talks about that very thing. That's one of the things he talks about, that Benedict becomes a power station of prayer. So this is the kind of life that Benedict is taking on. That is the kind of the spiritual link that is being talked about here in these quotes. There is this legal spiritual formula of Pope Emeritus avoids any idea of there being two popes at the same time. So he's not a pope in any way. And he says a bishopric can only have one incumbent. So the bishopric of Rome can only have one true pope. Benedict is admitting this. He explicitly says it. But the formula, Pope Emeritus, also expresses a spiritual link. Well, he's Pope Emeritus, is that he still, even though he has lost office, as Canon 185 kind of alludes to, the loss of office, the spiritual link, his attachment to his sons and daughters and all that, even though he has no longer authority over them or any kind of official relationship with them, he still has this spiritual link, this bond of charity with them. That can never be taken away. That's what he's referring to. So I just wanted to kind of get that out there as we go on now to address the rest of Ms. Barnhardt's objection. Okay, with all that as background, let's proceed now to reply to objection 3. Again, the objection is there's a violation of the principle of non-contradiction. Benedict XVI's resignation cannot be like every other papal resignation if Benedict is history's first Pope Emeritus. Well, that's just a summary of the objection. We went through the objection in greater detail before. So let's get to the reply now that we've laid down the framework for it. All right, so the first thing I point out in my reply is that having seen that Ms. Barnhardt misstated the principle of non-contradiction, and then we properly reframed it, where it's thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. So once we reframe it, we'll see that there is no violation of the principle of non-contradiction after all, as wrongly claimed by Ms. Barnhardt. So we see a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. So in this case as to Pope Emeritus. In one sense, and again, that's the key here, in one sense, it's clear. He is, as Ganswein said, Benedict is history's first, as he was the first to use the title Pope Emeritus. That's clear. So he is the first in that sense. However, while he is the history's first Pope Emeritus in a sense, certainly that he was the first to use the title, in another sense, he was not the first Pope Emeritus. And this we saw certainly from the pen of Pope Benedict XVI. In his back and forth with his back and forth with Cardinal Brandmuller, he was kind of ticked at Cardinal Brandmuller, who had suggested in an interview that Pope Emeritus never existed before in history. So Benedict's response, as we already quoted, so I won't pull it up again, but he had said that he said to Brandmuller, he said to him that, of course, you know very well that popes have retired, even if rarely. What were they afterwards? Pope Emeritus or what instead? So the rhetorical point is, of course, they were a Pope Emeritus. That's the point that Benedict's making. So he's saying not that they use the title, because we know that Pope Benedict was the first to adopt that title. His point was what he is entitled now, or then after his resignation, they were in fact, if not named, back then. So he's claiming that that the existence of what a Pope Emeritus is pre-existed him in other popes. That's the claim. So here we can see there is no violation of the principle of non-contradiction, because in one sense he is the first. He took the title. In another sense, in the sense that other retired popes were Pope Emeritus in fact and not title, we can see that there is no contradiction here of the principle of non-contradiction. But then we can kind of keep on going through some of the other comments that Ms. Barnhart had kind of pulled out in her objection. One has to do with Ganswein saying that Benedict was entirely different. As to entirely different, Benedict XVI was the first former pope who explicitly set for himself the lifelong task of continuing in service to the Church in prayer. And this I just talked about a couple slides, 2 or 3 slides earlier, about how in the last audience he talked about how he had gained sons and daughters when he became pope, that he had lost his privacy, the private dimension of his life. That's kind of lost forever. So it's lost always and forever. Even when he retired, he can't get back that privacy, because he now has this kind of spiritual link to all those who became his sons and daughters. He just can't walk away from that now that he's retired. He still has this love and affection, and kind of like he feels a inner spiritual moral responsibility to love them, and all that requires him in Benedict's view. And it's a very beautiful sentiment laid out in his last audience. And he's going to continue to pray for the Church. So Benedict is the first one who kind of laid it out structurally what he plans to do as a Pope Emeritus. And looking at what Ganswein said, where he had used that term entirely, or that phrase entirely different, let's just take a closer look at that. Again, this is Ganswein's words from his speech. He's speaking of Benedict. Since then, his role, allow me to repeat it once again, is entirely different. from that, for example, of the Holy Pope Celestine V. So, who, after his resignation in 1294, would have liked to have returned to being a hermit. I mentioned this earlier. He became instead, he wanted to become a hermit, but soon after he resigned, Boniface VIII arrested him, put him in jail. So after that, so he wanted to return to being a hermit, but instead became a prisoner of his successor, Boniface VIII. To date, in fact, there has never been a step like that taken by Benedict XVI. There's a couple of ways that's the case. One, as I just said, Benedict had set for himself this idea that he would continue to serve the church through prayer, even though he's resigned, no longer had the power of governance. He said that in his last audience, but he will continue to pray for the church, for his sons and daughters who he had this bond of charity with since the moment he became Pope. And even though he has resigned, the bond of charity persists. And so he just can't walk away from that and return to just being this private guy. He knows out there that they've been his sons and daughters at one time. He's going to continue to pray for them. That's the point that Benedict was making in his last audience, and that's the point that Ganswein's making here. So Benedict is the first to really make this explicit step of saying that he's going to continue praying, and that's how praying for the whole church. That's kind of different from what Celestine did. Why it's entirely different from what Celestine tried to do or wanted to do. Celestine wanted to go back to his cave or wherever he lived, or in the hills or in the woods or something, wherever he lived as a hermit. That's what he wanted to go back to. So this kind of private life. Whereas Benedict is entirely different. He wanted to engage and pray for the church. So that's how he was entirely different. But there's other senses in which he's entirely different as well. And we'll get into that here momentarily. Okay, so we see that how Benedict, certainly in this one sense, was entirely different. We saw how he was entirely different from Celestine V, for example. Benedict, having given up the office completely, though he had given up the office completely, he still wanted to pray for his sons and daughters, the church. He kind of set that as his goal, his mission, to kind of be a power station of prayer for the church. That's what he was going to set for kind of like his life's mission as a former pope. So that's one way in which he was entirely different. Are there other ways? Let's see. All right, so we saw in that one way, at least, he was entirely different, as say in the case of Celestine V. But let's look at another statement that Ganswein had said in his speech. He goes to he says, to date there has never been a step taken like that of Pope Benedict the 16th, or Benedict the 16th, because he was resigned at that point. So again, a seemingly extraordinary claim, but what did he mean by that? Well, we already saw above, in terms of him being entirely different, we know it's true for that reason above that we talked about, that Benedict, as former Pope, was going now to set himself the mission of praying for the sons and daughters that he took on when he became Pope. And even though he had left being Pope completely, he still had this bond of charity towards his sons and daughters. He wasn't just going to walk away and go back to a private life. He can't do that. He has a sense of moral responsibility, spiritual responsibility to them. So he's going to continue to pray for the church, kind of be a power station of prayer, a term that Ganswein actually uses in his speech. But I think there's another way in which Benedict was entirely different, because he was, aside from Celestine V, really only one of two popes who really walked away from the papacy for no reason other than didn't want to do it anymore. In the case of Celestine V, he wanted to go back to being a hermit. And in the case of Benedict, he was just too weak. Other popes had left because they were, trying to solve a great schism or something with like 2 or 3 popes, and one would resign to kind of solve the problem, so to speak. So that type of thing would go on. But in the case of Benedict, his step was different also in this new sense, is that I think it seems apparent that Benedict hoped to establish a precedent for other popes in the future. In other words, that they would step down, if they became too old and enfeebled. In fact, you see this in his interviews with Seewald. He talks about he talks about John Paul II, how he became weakened at the end, and even though he doesn't throw John Paul II under the bus, he does praise his, his last few years of suffering and all that. But clearly, and we all saw it, John Paul II was an enfeebled pope for the last couple of years or so of his life. But Benedict, in his interviews with Seewald, had talked about that he felt that he was too weak to do the office, and therefore felt a moral responsibility to step down from the throne of St. Peter. And I think he actually used words to that effect, if not literally. That's what he said in his interviews. And so what Ganswein talks about, which is entirely the step that no other pope took, Ganswein talks about this step as being an extraordinary act of courage. How is it an extraordinary act of courage? Well, according to Ganswein, that Benedict has renewed the office by his resignation. And with his final effort, he has strengthened the office. How is it? How does he mean that? Well, he means that by being able to walk away from the office when he's too weak to do it, instead of hanging on and leaving the church perhaps for several years with a weak pope who really can't govern effectively. That Benedict has strengthened the papacy by setting an example for future popes potentially, that when they get into a similar state of being too weak or feeble, that they will resign to allow a younger pope, more energetic pope, to come in and govern effectively. So that was certainly I think the hope that Benedict had, and that's certainly I think the sense that Ganswein has here about this being a step that no other pope has done. No other pope has resigned to set an example of leaving when you're old and weak. No other pope had done that before, so it was a new step, and it certainly could, at least arguably, be said that it would strengthen the church with the papacy if popes would do that. Now, I don't think popes should resign. I mean, we've seen the controversies that arise if that happens, but arguably you could say how someone could possibly see it that way, and certainly I think that's what comes through with Benedict in his interviews with Seewald, and also again in Ganswein's speech. Okay, we're getting near to the end here of part 1 of our treatment of Ganswein's speech, just in terms of kind of summarizing things here. We looked at 3 of 4 objections that we'll look at. Part 2 of this video series, we'll look at objection 4. That's where we'll look at things such as Ganswein's references to things like an expanded Petrine ministry, a quasi-shared ministry, a synodal ministry and those types of things that Benepapists say indicate that Benedict had in mind that there was going to be this kind of collegial papacy or something like that. So we'll take a look at that in part 2. But just to kind of sum up what we've looked at so far in the 3 objections that we looked at with regard to Ganswein's speech. The first was the claim. The first one was the claim that, kind of like a plain reading of both the last audience and Ganswein's speech should yield an interpretation in line with Anne Barnhart's interpretation, that if it didn't, you're fundamentally dishonest, you're a liar, and you must have some sort of financial motive or some such nonsense. And as we saw, that's just simply not a serious objection. It's fallacious. It's ad hominem. It poisons the well. It's gaslighting, pure and simple. I've been on the receiving end of various ad hominem attacks from various Benepapists over the years. I think they're kind of funny, but it just kind of shows that I think whenever the other side has to resort to ad hominems, it just shows that your arguments are over the target. So when you can't attack the arguments, you attack the person. And that's what's really going on in that first objection. And then we saw an objection about the over-the-top superlatives. And I think it's clear that Ganswein's, if you just kind of found Ganswein's speech somewhere, without knowing anything about it, you'd say, yeah, that's kind of over the top. You're comparing something that a mere man did to what God did with the Immaculate Conception. He could do it, therefore he did do it, and all that. I mean, that's kind of amazing. And then all the superlatives that Ganswein did put into the speech. But we're not just finding a speech on the street or something like that. We know the speech. We know the context of the speech. We know that it was given on the occasion of a book presentation. We know it was not intended to be a theological treatise on anything. So you're not going to get a lot of precision in terms and definition of terms. We know that it was given by a close friend of Benedict for many years in the person of Ganswein. We know that things that Ganswein would have in mind as he gave this kind of overview of Father Regali's book. He knew that Dante had put Celestine V, kind of one of the example popes for Benedict, had put him in hell for walking away from the papacy. And he also knew, going into his speech, that there were a lot of close friends and associates of Benedict, Ganswein included, who were opposed to the resignation. So those are things that Ganswein, as a speaker, surely must have had in mind. I certainly have not corresponded with him on that question. But I can imagine having those types of things in mind when you're trying to give a nice speech about someone who you care about, who you're a close friend with. You want to make the case that relating to the topic at hand, the presentation of the book, on his pontificate, on Benedict's pontificate. You want to talk about what a great pope he was. And then knowing that a lot of people were disappointed in his resignation, you want to kind of spin that as a positive thing in some way. And that's why I think we see a lot of the superlatives in what Ganswein says about Benedict and his resignation. That's why we see the things about making statements like this is the greatest thing, the greatest step or most unique step taken, or he has renewed the papacy or strengthened the papacy because of this. All, trying to say the nicest thing you can say about that situation, knowing what happened, trying to find something unique that you can kind of cast in a very, 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 very positive light about someone that for whom you have great affection for. So I think the context shows that it's understandable why we're seeing a lot of these superlatives in what Ganswein said. And that leads us now then to the third of the objections that we looked at was, again, and Barnhart's claim that there was a violation of the principle of non-contradiction. That on the one hand you have people saying that this is the first this resignation is just like every other resignation of a pope before, but it's not like every other resignation. That you can't have those two things. And the problem that Miss Barnhart had when she kind of analyzed this is that she didn't properly use the principle of non-contradiction. She actually didn't state it properly. I assume she probably in her heart and mind she knows what it is, but that's not what she said. She said the principle of non-contradiction is a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time. Well, that's part of it, but the part she left out is, well, it is also that at the same time. A thing cannot both be and not be at the same time. Cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same sense, or same way, or same sense. And if you look at what is said about Benedict and what Benedict said about what he did, you can see that in the different senses, the principle does not, there is no contradiction here. So, for example, we know that Benedict is the first Pope Emeritus in the sense that he was the first to use the title Pope Emeritus. That is absolutely the case. But we also saw in Pope Emeritus Benedict's correspondence with Cardinal Brandmuller after the resignation. In his correspondence with Cardinal Brandmuller, who had, in an interview with a German paper, had asserted that there's been nothing in history like Pope Emeritus before, and in a sense was obliquely criticizing Benedict for that. So Benedict kind of shot back at Cardinal Brandmuller in private correspondence, saying, of course there's been other resigned popes in history. What were they if they were not Pope Emeritus? What else? So the meaning of that is, of course, is that Benedict is alleging that these former popes were also a Pope Emeritus, not in name, because we know they were not in name. They were something else. They might have gone back to cardinal or whatever titles they took. But they were, what he's saying is, they were in fact what he is entitled. He took the title on as the first one to use the title, but they were the same thing in the past. It might be, for example, that whoever the first pope to use the title Pope in history, and I'd have to probably look at my J.N.D. Kelly's book of the Oxford Dictionary of Papacy, who was the first one to actually use the title Pope. Let's just say it wasn't until the 400 AD. Let's just make that up as theoretically. Let's just say it happened in 400 AD that the first Pope to use the title Pope was in 400 AD. He was the first one to use it. But all the other popes beforehand were popes, in fact, just not in the title. They were, in fact, the same thing, but the title just appeared later. So that's the point. That's why there's no contradiction here. no contradiction here, because Benedict was the first to use the title. In Benedict's mind, that's clearly the case. We know that for a fact. But what Benedict is saying, that they all were Pope Emeritus preceding him who had retired. So there is no contradiction, as Miss Barnhart alleges. And then I pointed out in subsequent slides that other ways in which Benedict was entirely different or had taken these first extraordinary steps. So we've seen that. We've seen, for example, that he was the first to take on this mission to pray for the church. We saw that he hoped to strengthen the church, hoped to strengthen the papacy by setting an example for future popes to resign when they were too weak to carry on, and by resigning, they made the way clear for another more effective pope potentially. So that's kind of, I think, the idea of what Benedict thought he was doing that was different and unique from all other popes, and what Ganswein thought as well when he gave his speech. Anyway, so that's kind of a summary of where we're at in part 4, or I'm sorry, in part 2 of this series. We'll take on objection 4. Okay, as we wind down this video, I'll leave, as I have before in the past, this resource page. Gives the books, my book, and articles by myself and other writers as well on the topic of Benepapism. Okay, that brings us to the end of this video, which is part 1 of a 2-part series on Ganswein's speech. If you liked it, please hit thumbs up and subscribe. If you didn't like it, hit thumbs down and don't subscribe. Anyway, stay tuned for part 2, which should be coming out pretty soon. Thank you.